Thanks, my dear friend and teacher. It's good to be with all of you today. It's amazing that we have close to 300 people on Zoom today, eager to learn about prayer as a native Jewish meditation practice. And I really just want to thank Valerie once again. As a trauma survivor myself, really touches my heart, Valerie, that you've dedicated this week of practice to trauma survivors. And I can say firsthand that the meditation and prayer practices we're going to be working on throughout this week have been tremendously healing for me in my own journey of integrating and healing from trauma. For those of you who are joining us today for the first time, we're just going to do a quick review of what we did yesterday and then jump into some new content to frame our meditative prayer practice today. The first thing I just want to note is that, sometimes we think there's mindfulness over here or meditation over here, and there's Jewish prayer over here, and never the twain shall meet. And some other folks may have the experience where the two converge, right? So for example, both in prayer and in meditation, we cultivate intentionality, focus. We try to open the heart through both practices and so on and so forth. But there, some people think of them as being essentially different, but having some degree of convergence. What I'm trying to suggest through our learning and practice this week is actually that originally in our tradition, they're one and the same. There's absolutely no difference. That contemplative prayer is meditation in our tradition. We've been exploring the terrain, right? What is the journey? Yesterday we explored prayer as a spiritual journey. Prayer is a spiritual journey. It's not a static experience. It's an experience that's meant to take us somewhere. And in that work, we explored the 4 worlds of Kabbalah as providing us with a map for where we're headed, and the different way stations along the way. So we're just going to take a look at a source from yesterday's source sheet, which you can find in the chat, from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, whose teaching we didn't get a chance to look at yesterday because we just didn't have enough time, and I wanted to make sure we had significant time for practice. We're going to revisit that today as a way of just kind of reorienting ourselves to the map, and also beginning to explore the ways in which the practice of prayer can be integrated into our journey through the 4 worlds, as I described it yesterday. So just bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll take a look together. Okay. After the Baal Shem Tov died, all of his teachings as transmitted by his students and their students and so on and so forth were culled into a book called Sefer Baal Shem Tov, a book of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings. And we're looking here at a teaching on Parashat Shemini from the book of Leviticus. And in that portion in Leviticus 9:6, Moses turns to the people and says, this is what the divine presence has commanded that you do, so that the divine presence may appear to you. Right? Giving practice instructions to the people for making the divine presence manifest. And then he goes on to explain a whole series of rituals and other practices that are connected with the tabernacle. The Baal Shem Tov teaches that, to make the divine presence manifest as God's light and God's truth, to guide us in our lives, and so that we might find ourselves in the divine abode, as is listed there in Psalm 43. He says we must focus our minds at all times upon the divine presence. Right? The word for focusing our minds is lechaven, which actually means to direct, to attune, right? Related to the word kavanah, which means intention or mindful attention. And we must focus our minds at all times upon the divine presence, the Shekhinah, the feminine divine presence, the manifest divine presence, which is loving in the way that a mother is loving toward her children. which fills the whole universe with its glory, based on Isaiah 6:3, and guides our minds from below to on high with great intensity. So how do we do that? Says the Baal Shem Tov, I'm skipping a line here. We enter the world of Yetzirah, which we talked about yesterday, the world of formation, which is connected with emotional consciousness, the emotional soul, right? Our ability to become conscious of what's happening at the emotional level. Then the world of Bria, the world of creation, which is associated with our capacity to become aware of our cognitive life. Then the world of Atzilut, or emanation, which is the world of pure consciousness, the world of pure spirit. So he's suggesting we can go from these kind of more concrete worlds into these more subtle worlds, and ultimately into a world of pure soul or pure consciousness. We first, he says, descend in our minds, and only then ascend. We must ascend and descend a number of times, for the descent is necessary for the ascent. It is by force of the descent that we can then ascend thereafter to a very transcendent place. Right? So this isn't a one-way static journey, right? He's suggesting that we cycle through these worlds. We actually go kind of inward, deeper, 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 right? And then we come back, right? When he talks about ascending and descending, he's using the language of his time, which is very vertical, right? But actually, we talked about yesterday how the spiritual journey is not a vertical journey. We don't leave this world, as it were. Instead, it's a journey inward to subtler and subtler dimensions of our own being, right? And from more form-bound aspects of our being, where everything looks separate and divided, to more formless and spiritual components of our being. It says this can be likened to a person who wishes to throw a stone. The more she lowers her hand with the stone in it, the more the stone will rise to great heights when she throws it, right? So actually, you might think that, if you want to go to a very transcendent place within, you need to kind of go straight to the mountaintop, as it were, right? And the Baal Shem says, actually, no. Counterintuitively, what we need to go is to go low to go high, right? Or we need to actually first go to the more concrete elements of our being, the more earthy elements of our being, in order to then be able to open a channel into the more spiritual dimensions of our being. And here's where he explains how this connects with prayer. When we rise up in our minds into the world of Asiya, which is the lowest domain, and don't worry, we're going to take a look at that chart again that we looked at yesterday, the domain of action, right? The domain of the body, or Yetzirah, the next dimension, which is the emotional realm, or we should focus on speaking words of prayer in that world, right? So first we establish ourselves in that world. We kind of take up residence or inhabit each of these individual worlds. And then he says, then we should utter words of prayer within the world itself, right? And then he also says all day long, even when it's not the appointed time for prayer, we should thus ascend in our minds continuously. So all throughout the day, we should be ascending and descending, right? Going into the deeper dimensions of our being and coming back out into the more form-bound and material dimensions of our being, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today, but we're going to be focusing on the concrete world of Asiya. And then what we're going to do is we're also going to incorporate prayer practice once we're in that world, so that we can begin to notice how uttering words of prayer, or even thinking words of prayer, when we're in that domain, can then impact the degree of our and quality of our consciousness, right? Our capacity to open our heart, our ability to be deeply focused and present, and so on and so forth. To help us go there, I want to take a look I want to take a look at the new source sheet, which I'm going to pull up here momentarily, and you should all have the link to that as well. Okay, today's topic is Asiya prayer, right? Praying in the concrete world of the body, descending into the Merkava, the chariot. Right? So there's actually a mystical tradition going back 2,000 years called Merkava mysticism, chariot mysticism. It's based on Ezekiel's prophecy or vision of a transcendent chariot upon which rides the divine presence. Right? And in the vision, the vision seems very transcendent. What we're going to see here is that in the Hasidic tradition, the chariot is actually something very concrete. very near and dear to us, very accessible and available to us. And as I said, we're going to be spending time today in this world of Asiya that you can see that I'm pointing to, right? And all of the different dimensions here are of a piece, which is to say, on the macrocosmic level, the world of Asiya, the world of doing or acting, right, exists within us on the microcosmic level as a quality of consciousness called nefesh, right, which is very bound up with our embodied being and our nervous system and our physical sensations. And the way that we know in that world is through direct sensing. Right. And then the morning prayer section that corresponds to that part of us that helps us to become more aware of that part of us is the morning blessings. And today we're going to be examining a little bit how the work within that world corresponds to one element within the Godhead itself on the level of the Sefirot, these channels for radiating and transmitting divine consciousness and light into our world. So don't worry about that piece yet. We're going to get there in just a moment. What I want to take a look at is this source from Rabbi Yitzchak Morgenstern, who's a contemporary Hasidic Kabbalist who lives in Jerusalem, in his book Yam HaChochma, which means the Sea of Wisdom. And in 5766, in that book, he published a meditation manual called Ma'amar Derech HaYichud, which means the discourse about the way of non-duality or the way of union. Okay, and in this book, he actually provides us with a graded path in Jewish meditation and prayer. And we're going to be looking at the first gate, which he calls the practice of engraving, in Hebrew, chakika. Okay, here's what he says. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now, so don't worry, there will be Q&A at the end if you'd like to stay on. And ultimately, when it comes to doing the practice, it's going to be fairly simple, but there's something we need to understand about how to actually frame and understand what we're doing. So the first stage, he says, is to recognize the chokhmah mind, the wisdom mind. The wisdom mind. We talked about chaya yesterday, the level of soul up here that's called chaya, right, which is associated with pure consciousness right here. Right, that part of us on the sephirotic level is known as the chokhmah mind, corresponds to the sephira of chokhmah, of wisdom, which is to say wisdom that flows directly from spirit. Okay. So we need to recognize this quality of mind. He doesn't say we need to attain it or somehow evolve into it. He says we need to recognize it, which is to say it's already there in us at the deepest depths of our being. And the work is really about recognition, right? Coming to know that it's there and what it's like, which he says corresponds to the right brain, right? So this is something different from the analytical mind. It's a kind of wisdom that's not based in analysis, right? But it's a kind of wisdom that arises intuitively out of spirit, that part of us that has no form, that is just pure consciousness. He says this is the dimension of pure spiritual light. And what we need to do is to open a channel to that light. Indeed, he says, we might more fittingly call the wisdom of Kabbalah the wisdom of delight. For the wisdom mind is the bliss mind, and the true Kabbalists merited to know this spiritual delight. He says being a Kabbalist is not about knowing a bunch of conceptual ideas, right, that are in the Kabbalah or knowing a lot of texts. It's actually about being able to receive. That's the word lekabel. Lekabel, a Kabbalist is one who knows how to receive, right, this divine light, which happens to be very delightful, right? When this light becomes more amplified in our system, it brings with it a sense of well-being, of delight, of spaciousness, sometimes bliss. Okay, so right, you want to know how to be more happy in your life, says the Yam HaChochma, right? Learn how to access this light and operate from that place, which is innately blissful. It's not the kind of happiness that you need to go buy somewhere at the store or get through having some experience, right? Or acquiring something. It's actually there at the core of our being, as long as we can recognize it. And so he goes on to say, this is what is meant by the phrase that often appears over the ark in synagogue, da lifnei mi ata omed, right? Know before whom you stand. It's meant to be a kavanah, an intention for us as we pray, to know that we're standing in the divine presence when we pray, right? But now he offers a mystical reading. Right? Look at that word who, right? It's me in Hebrew. Me is who, right? For who is the dimension of Bina. If we go back to this Sephirotic kind of charting here, right? Bina is the Sephirah, the element within divinity itself that corresponds to our thinking mind, right? And it usually comes with a sense of deep penetrating understanding if we access that part of ourselves. And through Bina, he says, which is called me in the Kabbalistic tradition, right? It's the part of us that asks, who am I? Who am I? Right? Me, who? Who am I? Who am I really? Right? And we can come into a deep quality of insight around that question. And through Bina, which is to say, through the practice of hitbonenut, notice the linguistic connection between the word Bina, right, and the root and the word the verb hitbonenut, which means contemplation, right? Of course, we can be lost in our discursive mind, thinking about lunch and the work deadline, right? But we can also use the mind to engage in deep contemplation about the question, who am I? Who am I really, right? And to contemplate spiritual matters. And when we're doing that, he says we're accessing the Bina mind. When we do that, we merit to come into the dimension of before who, right? Before who, lifnei, that which precedes Bina, which is Chokhmah. Right? What he's saying essentially, don't worry about knowing all the Kabbalah, is through the practice of contemplation, right, which actually uses the analytical mind, right? We can come into a trans-analytical state. We can actually transcend to a state or a dimension of our being that transcends the rational thinking mind, right? That is trans-rational, which is the Chokhmah mind, pure spirit, out of which wisdom flows intuitively. Now, the first esoteric secret in this matter is to know that in order to enter the dimension of Chokhmah, we need to descend into the Merkava. We need to descend into the chariot. This is what the Baal Shem Tov was basically saying. To explain this, we will first say that generally speaking, we humans exist in the dimension of Ze'er Anpin, which means immature face when translated into English, which is the soul dimension Ruach. So we're going to look up here at our chart for just a moment. Right, we talked already about the wisdom mind, right? Wisdom that flows from pure spirit. We talked about using the analytical mind to contemplate deeply into the nature of things, including the nature of self, right? But there's also this other dimension within the Sefirot, which is the Sephira of Tiferet, along with the other 5 adjoining to it, Chesed, Gevura, Netzach, Chod, and Yesod. Don't worry if you don't know these terms, right? They're not so important for our purposes. But in the Lurianic system, that assemblage is called Ze'er Anpin, which literally means small, young, or immature face. Right? Usually, our sense of self, says our teacher here, is kind of immature, right? And it's bound up with the level of our inner life, which is the Ruach level, right? Which is associated with our emotions, which is to say, our sense of personhood is very conditioned by our emotional life, right? And the sense of I am this, I am that, I am this person, right? I'm not that person, whatever the case may be, is very bound up and conditioned by our emotions, right? So for example, you can think about a moment in your life when, for example, someone said something that triggered a sense of anger, indignation in you, right? And you can probably if you check this out in your own experience, or even revisit that experience in your mind, you can probably sense there was a very rigid, strong sense of self, right? In that moment, I am angry. They are bad. I am good, right? So there's a strong sense of self. There's a strong sense of a person in here who's been wronged, right? And it's very conditioned, that sense of self, by our emotional experience, right? And there's a kind of immature quality to that sense of self because it's always reacting, right? And it always sees itself over and against others as being in the center of things. Says our teacher, right? Underneath that dimension is the chariot, which is Malchut, which is akin to a throne. So, if we want to transcend that kind of immature sense of self that's totally bound up with our emotional life and conditioned by our negative emotions, right, or our destructive emotions, you might think we need to go higher, right? We need to somehow transcend. Says the Baal Shem Tov, no, what we need to do is actually rest in the dimension just underneath, which is the level of Malchut, which means sovereignty, right? which is associated again with sensing in the body or the nefesh level of our being, this embodied consciousness. So what's the chariot, right? It's not something transcendent. It's not something that we need to somehow escape the world to get to. It's actually our physical being. Awareness of our physical being here and now creates a kind of chair or throne upon which the Chokhmah mind can manifest through our contemplation. Right? So the first stage is cultivate some body awareness. Drop down into the body. That will then create the vehicle or the vessel, right, to do this contemplation practice and access our insight mind, the Bina mind, which will then help us transcend to and recognize the dimension of mind that is lifnei mi, that precedes the Bina mind, which is Chokhmah, pure spirit. Okay. Now, I'm skipping a paragraph. To successfully descend into the chariot, the dimension of Malchut, which is the dimension of the body, we must first learn what the rules of Malchut are. Right? First, we know that she is called sitting, while the Ze'er in our emotional life, right, is called standing and walking. For us humans wish constantly to walk and rise from level to level, while Malchut, which is the dimension of the body, wishes to sit still. She doesn't want to walk, but instead lingers. Think about it, right? When you're all revved up emotionally, you can't sit still. You want to act. You want to change something out there in the world. You want to control your environment so that you can get rid of those emotions, right? So there's a tendency to kind of just be really stirred up in the body, right? And then the energy in the body kind of pulls you forward, right? But when we drop down into the body in a way that's not totally kind of conditioned by our emotional life, but instead, we're really in the body, sensing the body moment by moment instead of reacting to whatever we're feeling, right? Then we can really linger and we can relax deeply in the body and we can get concentrated. This power that Malchut possesses is called chakika, or engraving or etching, which refers to lingering with the same idea or image in the mind, such that our attention doesn't wander onward, but stays there in the same place. And when we get still, he's saying, right, we can begin to engrave, right, using this contemplation practice, we can begin to engrave a single thought or phrase from the prayer service into the mind, right? Because the mind isn't running and jumping hither and yon, because we're no longer being driven by our emotional reactivity, but instead we're really present and we can linger with a single thought. Right? He says the meditator who knows how to properly employ her thoughts by using the power of imagination, engraving a single concept into her mind, can become a chariot for the indwelling of divinity itself. Then Chokhmah, the source of our spiritual delight, can also dwell upon the chariot. All of this is affected by beginning to contemplate holy thoughts or images, for example, thinking about the Holy and Blessed One or about the light that surrounds us. When we thus use our powers of contemplation along with the dimension of Malchut, right, which is embodied awareness, through engraving and lingering by thinking about a single thought in the mind and staying there, being present in the body and with those thoughts, the two together become a great force that can open up the light of Chokhmah, the light of spiritual bliss. I just dropped a lot on you, right? A whole lot. But essentially, it's very simple. Right. Essentially, what he's saying is, you gotta stand. You gotta pause. You gotta stop all the activity. Right. That's often being driven by our emotional reactivity, and you have to drop down into the body and create a kind of chariot or vehicle. Right. And then once you do that, you can begin to contemplate the words of prayer, these holy words, right, that flow from the religious experiences of people throughout the ages as expressions of higher consciousness, right? And an awareness of their proximity with the divine. And as you do that, little by little, access to the Chokhmah mind, right, to the part of us that is pure spirit will open up. And we'll feel ourselves intimately proximate to the divine. Because remember, the work of prayer, as we said yesterday, is for us to come into unity with our divine source. Okay, so that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to spend a couple of minutes practicing embodied awareness. And after we find ourselves kind of inhabiting our chariot a little bit more fully, I'm going to invite us to work with one snippet of prayer, which is right up here on the screen. Right, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Rokaha Aretz Alamayim, taken from the morning blessings. Blessed are you, or you are blessing itself, loving presence, mother of all beings, spreading the earth over the waters. And I'll provide some instructions for how to work with that using this kind of a contemplative approach, where we repeat the phrase over and over and over and over and over again in the mind while we're inhabiting this world of Asiya, the world of the body, and kind of resting in this inner chariot. So let's settle in. We can take a moment to adjust our posture so that we can remain relatively still and quiet. You might notice right away as you settle if there's any kind of reactive energy in the body, any emotions that are welling up that might be inhibiting your capacity to sit still. And if there are, you can put a hand on your heart and say to yourself, it's okay. It's okay. Give yourself some reassurance and permission to let it go for a little while. And I want to invite you to take a number of deep breaths all the way down into your abdomen. On each in-breath, see if you can become a little bit more present to the breath. This experience of aliveness in the body. And then on each out-breath, see if you can relax a little bit more and let go of any tension, any clenching, any tightness in the body. We're dropping down into the Merkava, into the chariot. If at any point the mind becomes distracted, we just come back gently and lovingly after giving the mind some love, acknowledging that it's wandered off and that that's normal and regular and perfectly okay. We just come back into the body, resting once again in this physical chariot and this most concrete dimension of our being, the body. And what I want to invite you to do after you've taken some deep breaths is to bring your attention to a point of contact with either the chair or the cushion or the floor. So that could be your bottom against the chair or the cushion or the mat. It could be your feet against the ground. Baal Shem Tov reminded us we need to go low to go high, right? We need to start externally at the surface level so that we can then create a vessel upon which the higher divine light can then manifest. And see if you can notice whatever sensations are here moment by moment by moment as you make contact with the support underneath your body, be it the chair or the floor. And notice the sense of stability, the sense of rootedness. The sense of weight. If at any point any of the sensations you're noticing elicit emotions that feel overwhelming, or other sensations that feel overwhelming, or even thought patterns that feel overwhelming, I want to invite you to open your eyes if they've been closed, although they can remain open as well. But if they've been closed, I want to invite you to open your eyes and name 5 things of one color, 4 things of another color, 3 things of a third color, 2 things of another color, and 1 thing of one final color. And then you can come back and start again. And in just a moment, I'm going to invite you to, as you inhabit the world of Asiya, this physical dimension of your being, the embodied soul, the embodied consciousness of direct sensing, to begin to utter in a soft hush, or just think these words from the Sidur. If it's helpful, you can coordinate them with the in-breath and the out-breath. So 1 breath per word. Or alternatively, if you're saying it in a hush, you can say a single word on the out-breath. Or you can leave the breath altogether and just continue to remain aware of being connected to the earth, being grounded, being rooted, and simultaneously begin to do the hakika practice, the engraving work of etching this prayer into the fabric of your psyche and noticing what arises on the embodied level. The words once again are Baruch Ata Adonai, or Berucha At Shekhinah, Eloheinu Melech Ruach Haolam, Rokah Haaretz Al Hamayim. You are the one who places solid ground upon the waters, upon the liquid core of this planet. Somehow there's stable ground afoot. And you can take the whole blessing or a part of it and just keep saying it over and over and over and over again. You can open your eyes for a second if they've been closed and look at the screen. Choose a part of the blessing, either in masculine, feminine form. And you can just keep repeating it. Slowly, intentionally, with the fullness of your presence, even as you feel yourself supported by firm ground. And it's entirely possible that by grounding ourselves in the body in this way and repeating this phrase over and over and over again, engraving it into our psyche, that we've become concentrated and focused, and we can begin to feel some of that spiritual delight. Our consciousness may become more bright. The sense of ease in the body may become more palpable. The mind may feel more expansive and luminous. When that happens, we can bring this heat bonanut practice in, this contemplation practice in, bringing the left brain back into our practice and contemplating what these words might mean. We can ask me or ma, right? Who's standing upon these? Who's standing upon this firm ground? What is this firm ground? What is the source of this firm ground? These can all be questions we can contemplate as we continue reciting the words and deepening our focus in the body. And for the last minute or so of this practice, before we turn to Mourner's Kaddish, we can let all that go and just abide in the silence. See if we can relax into the spaciousness of mind, the natural spaciousness of mind that may have become more palpable. And you can continue to abide in this state even as we turn to Mourner's Kaddish. Just allowing the words to move through your consciousness. Bearing witness, responding Amen. And I'll turn it over now to Mark.
Thank you so much, my friend, Rabbi Sam Feinsmith. Friends, we do seal our practice today, as we always do, offering an opportunity for those in mourning or observing yard site to share the name or names of those you're honoring or holding in your heart today, and inviting you to join me in rising in body or in spirit to recite Kaddish together. Yit Gadol, Yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
Bialma, Diva, Shurute, Biamlich, Malchute, V'chaye Chon, V'yamechon, V'chaye Dechol Beit Yisrael, V'adala, V'izman Kariv, Imru,
Amen.
Yehi
Yehi Shmei Rabba Mavarach
Leolam
Maya.
Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yitpa'ar, Yitramam, Yitnaseh, Yithadar, Yitaveh, Yitahal, Yemed, Yitchel, La'ela, Kol Birchata, V'Torata, Tushbata, Hikmata, Amiran Ba'alma, V'Imru, Amen. Shlama, Rabba, Min Shemaya, Chaim Maleim,
Amen.
Shalom, Shalom.
Amen.
Amen. Just want to invite us, even as Mark sees us off now, to see if we can continue staying in the world of Asiya, aware of what's happening in the body, continuing to abide in this Merkava, even as sounds arise and pass away, the sounds of speaking and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Sam. Friends, we're happy to stay on and for another 14 minutes or so. And if you have a question about that rich and beautiful teaching today and about our practice together, please put it in the chat box, and if possible, preface it by writing question before. Before we move on to that, I do want to thank those of you who have to leave at this point. Thanks for being with us. We hope you'll join us tomorrow or the rest of the week. All these sessions, as usual, recorded, posted on our YouTube channel if you miss any or if you'd like to review. We want to thank Valerie Taylor for sponsoring this entire week of practice together. Thank you so much, Valerie. Just looking at questions. So there is a specific question. Before we get there, Sam, I just want to, I like to always try to just do a quick summation about the teaching, which in this case is not so easy. It is, and it isn't so easy because it was so rich. I felt like saying, we're not serving, mighty fine pudding here. We're kojo. We're serving creme brulee. It was rich and sweet and beautiful. Thank you so much. Upshot of it for me was the idea that we can connect with our deepest selves or our spiritual essence by being exactly where we are in our bodies, in our physical self, in this world, right? Which, like as you said, is counterintuitive. We think the quest for connection with the divine means getting out of this body and getting out of ourselves, staying up in our head, which we're so good at. But to the contrary, offer that beautiful teaching, and the Merkava, which literally means chariot, really presenting our very bodies as the chariot from which we can connect. Got that? Is that a good 30-second summation?
Yeah.
So my question for you is going back to the question of meditation and prayer. Question and comment combined in one, really, which is that when I think of prayer, I usually think about it as entering into the use of dualistic language, meaning prayer is speaking to or conversing with, interacting with God, the divine, the one, the presence, however one wants to describe. whereas meditation is the process of growing an awareness of that presence and of that reality. I'm not sure if you're presenting it that way here, but the use of a blessing, in which I'm using dualistic language, blessed are you, or I'm addressing that spiritual reality as a focal point, or as a not very analytic way of just sort of bringing those together into one experientially. The question here is that what you were doing? Like, how do we connect meditation and prayer that way? Or are you really saying here, in some sense, that meditation is prayer?
I'm saying that meditation is prayer, right? Where prayer is originally meditation is a more accurate way to say it, right? And someone in the chat asked about the difference between Chokhmah and Atzilut, right? For those who may be familiar with the Sephirotic tree, right? And I'll go back to the image here real quickly, because I actually do have a diagram here in the sheet, right? This is a nice diagram that someone made, right? So what we essentially did using Kabbalistic language is, we brought Chokhmah, which is the dimension of consciousness, pure consciousness, right? We allowed that to kind of percolate down into Malchut, right? This kind of concrete dimension of the body, sometimes also understood as the earth itself, right? Of which we are made. But our earthiness, our visceral embodied nature, right? We essentially kind of allowed consciousness to permeate and fill and saturate that element of our being, right? Through embodied awareness and presence, which can take us out of this kind of reactive heart. We're constantly reacting to our emotional life, and in so doing can clear the channels, as it were, for the Chokhmah mind to manifest more readily at all levels of our being. Now, what I showed everybody yesterday, and we can see it today as well, is that as long as even if we go all the way up to Chokhmah, or bring Chokhmah all the way down to Malchut, either way, right? We have still not achieved the total non-dual state, right? The non-dual state is when you reach Keter or Atzilut, right? Keter is associated with the world of sorry, I apologize. Chokhmah is associated.
Sam, sorry, you have to unmute.
Apologize. Keter is associated with a world that's not even listed in our chart. That's called Adam Kadmon, right? And Atzilut is associated with Chokhmah itself, right? So you can get to the world of Atzilut, a world of pure spirituality, a world of true formlessness, and you can recognize the emptiness of the self in that world. But that doesn't mean that you've been completely absorbed into the divine source, right? So there is still an Atah, which is to say the divine source that I can address on that level, right? Until one merges completely with the divine source in Keter, at which point, right, I become a cell within the vast organism, or a wave within the ocean itself, and I have literally no independent or separate existence. Right? Then there is really no place to address the divine as Atah, as a you. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. I just want to get, there are a lot of great questions here, which, we're not going to necessarily get to all of them. But I'm thinking about the way Art Green in his writings describes, our self, our small self, as a kind of microcosm of the self of the cosmos, right? And in a sense, you're describing a process of reducing that sense of distance between the small self and the larger self until it is, like what you just said, is subsumed within that. There's a great question, which I think really, we would be good to address, from Laura, about how do you guide someone who's ailing with disease and pain to, quote, drop into the body, to access the part of us which is pure spirit? It's a question that'll come up a lot. That's an important one.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I just want to say I've suffered from chronic pain since I was about 26. I'm 44 now. So it's a very live question for me. what I'll say is that there are kind of two approaches to practicing mindfulness in the body when there's pain, chronic pain, or acute pain, right? One is go to a place in the body that's not in pain, right? Which is, let's say you have a pain in your wrist or your elbow or, somewhere else in the body. So focus on an area of the body that feels neutral to pleasant. And that could be the fingertips, could be the sensations in the toes. It could be, the vibrations at the top of the forehead or the crown of the head or whatever, right? So you'll have to do a little bit of experimentation with that. But there's no reason that you need to dive into what's painful in order to cultivate presence in the body. In fact, if you go straight to what's painful, it's likely that the mind will kind of cave in on itself and will become very tight and constricted, and then concentration won't be possible because the mind will become restless and react in reaction to its own sense of suffering and contraction. But then, right, and this is one of the promises of our practice over time, is that over time we can increase our window of tolerance and our capacity to be with unpleasant sensations without becoming reactive, and without the heart and the mind becoming narrow and tight, right? When that happens, then we can go right into the unpleasant sensation itself and cultivate presence there and experience it as energy moving through consciousness with an unpleasant valence as opposed to something afflictive, right? So I can tell you myself, right, that over the years I've developed my capacity to abide with pain and experience it as pain, but without it causing me suffering. And I'm not saying I can do that all the time, right? And I'm not saying I can do it every single time. And I'm not saying I can always do it with a 10, right, as opposed to a 2 or a 3 on the level of, the degree and intensity of pain that I'm feeling. I'm saying fairly often, though, that I can abide with unpleasant sensations in the body, my heart closing or my mind becoming restless, right? And in the pain itself, I can actually discover an anchor that can, in some ways, help me to concentrate more than if I was focusing on something neutral or pleasant. Because it's actually hard to look away from pain, right? The difficulty is not that we tend to ignore it or look away from it. The difficulty is we get so pulled into it, but we don't have enough spaciousness of mind, right, to be able to hold it without becoming reactive and losing our focus. So if we can cultivate this kind of spaciousness of mind, essentially the chokhmah mind, right, which is very vast and can really hold anything, right? The more we have access to that quality of mind and can shine it into the body, then we can sit even with painful experiences without it being a problem, really.
Yeah, Sam, so we got 2 questions. We only have 2 minutes.
Yeah, and I have some questions from yesterday also, but we'll get right. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one might be the one that fits in the time, which is what's summarizing the function of engraving, the engraving practice, just to kind of review that. Then Karen has a very big question, which, if not today, would be good, of course, to deal with it at some point, about trauma itself. Deep process can trigger strong emotion, what then focus back on the body. So we will deal with that.
Good. Yeah, and I'll continue to offer modifications throughout this mini course. Because again, I'm a trauma survivor myself, and I've had to learn the hard way how to offer myself modifications so that I can stay within my window of tolerance. I really like this term, chakika, engraving, right? Because when we talk about mindfulness in secular terms, we talk about cultivating concentration, right? But what that doesn't convey is the sense of engraving. Think of the image, right? You're etching an image into stone, right? So there's the way in which the mind can sometimes feel like a kind of hard stone, right? But through this gentle practice of returning to the phrase again and again and again, we begin to etch it into the psyche in a way that actually begins to shift our mental patterns, right? And also in a way that enables us to have access to the phrase, the prayer phrase, and all of the emotional resonance that it carries right? And the mind expanding and opening capacity that it has in the midst of our daily life, right? So, for example, I was chanting the other day with Rabbi Shefa Gold through one of her prayer courses that we offer. And I was doing that practice myself, a kind of prayer practice also. And because I had chanted it and really kind of engraved it into my, not only my mind, but really my nervous system in a deep way, right? Later in the day, when my daughter was totally freaking out because she wanted to shampoo her hair a third time and my wife wasn't letting her, right? The chant just came to me, the words came to me unbidden, and all of the emotional resonance. And it expanded my mind and allowed me to be able to actually make a real adjustment to how I wanted to kind of habitually rush into that experience. And that all happened in a second, right? Just like this. Again, because I had literally etched it into the fabric of my psyche, right? So the etching practice doesn't only have the effect of deepening our concentration, it actually begins to shift the habits of our body mind over time, and also creates a situation where the new habits become available to us when we need them.
All right, we are at or slightly over time, so let's respect the boundary of our time together. Thank Adi Stein, as always, for holding our space beautifully with skill and grace, and thank Valerie Taylor for sponsoring our week practice, and thank our teacher, Rabbi Sam Feinsmith, for leading us so beautifully today. And just a reminder that all the recordings are on the YouTube channel. If you missed anything worth revisiting, all of them, of course, avail yourself of that opportunity. We hope to see you back tomorrow at the same time, 12:30 Eastern, to continue this series. Be well, everyone. Many blessings.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark.